Okay. Good afternoon. We're thrilled today to be presenting a timely webinar entitled History and the Law, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in Context. It is sponsored by the ABA section on Civil Rights and Social Justice and the Coalition on Racial and Ethnic Justice at the ABA. This panel is one of many in a series commemorating Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We're actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. Today's program will involve questions and answers, so please use the Q&A function on your screen, not the chat function. If you don't see the controls, please ensure that your screen isn't idle. And the questions will help us connect you with the discussion that our panelists are bringing you. There'll be a recording of the program for everyone who is registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. The term Asian American and Pacific Islanders are both relatively recent identifications. Clearly, both are very diverse and different histories and cultures. That diversity is such that panels such as these can never really cover all of that history or all the groups. Some of them are very unique, some of which will be covered in some of the webinars that will follow us in this month's programming. So I urge you to look for those and consider that. What we'll focus on this panel with is the commonalities, the history, and how all of this is pulled together. And in addition, looking at what's going on in the world currently, the anti-Asian harassment and violence that's kind of exploded in the last couple of years. But I think our panel here today will discuss not only that, but how this is really not new. We've seen recently, really over the past year and a half with the pandemic, that scapegoating by President Trump and others has led to an explosion of incidents. But it really isn't new. Well, that has kind of taken the cork out of the bottle. That kind of scapegoating occurred back in the 19th century with the Yellow Peril and politicians in California and the West Coast who exploited fears about unemployment and the differentness of Asians, really in all of our groups. We saw an explosion in those times of violence and harassment. There were lynchings, there were groups driven out of towns in Colorado, in Los Angeles, in Oregon, Chinese, South Asians. It just was a very common experience for Asian groups in that era. Since then, we've also seen the development of legal discrimination, beginning with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first race-based immigration law. We've seen bars to naturalization, later biased immigration quotas. We've seen alien land laws that have kept Asians from owning land, from owning boats. And like African Americans, we've also faced anti-miscegenation laws. There have been bars to testifying against whites. And then during World War II, we've seen the mass incarceration of the West Coast Japanese American population. So the law has been a tool against us, and we've always had a lack of resources to challenge that discrimination. Yet at the same time, the law has provided us with tools that have given us a chance to seek justice. Chinese Americans brought cases that protected birthright citizenship. There's been challenges to laws that were applied in a discriminatory fashion. We've had hate crimes situations where we've sought and pushed for prosecution, like the Vincent Chin case. And we've seen how the racism that binds us as a group really has also bound us in terms of our solutions. And I think that the panel today is an example of that. All the panelists have worked for justice and for advocated for the community's interests, looking at history, looking at the law. And it's also appropriate, I think, that we're today here under the auspices of the American Bar Association, because the law is both the threat that we faced and the tool that we can use to solve injustice. So let me review our panelists today. First, we're going to have Lorraine Bannai, who's director of the Fred Korematsu Center for Law and Equality and a professor at Seattle University School of Law. Then we'll have John Yang, president of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Then we'll have Deepa Iyer, strategic advisor, Building Movement Project and director of Solidarity Is. And finally, we'll have Tim Ma, who's co-founder of Chefs Stopping AAPI Hate and a chef at Lucky Danger. So with that, we'll begin. And I'm going to ask Lori to start off. I think that it's appropriate for Lori to lead us, both because of her educational background, but she was also a member of the Korematsu Quorum Nobis team, and that can provide some background for our discussion here today. Lori?
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you so much, all of you attending here and the ABA for pulling this program together during this really important time. I'm going to use my remarks to kind of delve a bit deeper into the historical background that Paul just kind of gave an overview of, a historical backdrop on the Asian American experience in this country, in order to underscore a few themes. One is, as Paul said, that the violence now happening against the Asian American community, while shocking and frightening, is not new. It's really a resurfacing of anti-Asian sentiment that's always been present. And also that this Asian American anti-Asian hostility cannot be viewed in isolation. It's born of the same othering that communities of color and immigrant communities have experienced in this country throughout our history. And then finally, as Paul mentioned, that not surprisingly, lawyers have played significant roles, not only in embedding racial stereotypes into the law and the public consciousness, but also importantly have been there acting in creative ways and with passion to challenge injustice. So just to kind of reiterate a couple of points that Paul made about our history, Asian Americans have been viewed and treated as perpetual foreigners, unassimilable, and dangerous since they first arrived in this country. One starting point is the 1889 case of Che Chan-ping, which upheld a statute barring Chinese who lived in this country from re-entering based on fear that Chinese were dangerous to this country. The court explained that it was beyond question that Congress could prevent foreign encroachment by the, quote, vast hordes of Chinese crowding in among us. The country didn't differentiate between people of Asian backgrounds, Chinese, Japanese, and other immigrants from Asian. And after the Chinese Exclusion Act, the same animosity that existed against Chinese was turned against other Asian American communities. So for example, in 1905, the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League argued that we cannot assimilate with them without injury to ourselves. We cannot compete with people having such a low standard of civilization, living, and wages. Newspaper headlines read, "Crime and poverty go hand in hand with Asiatic labor. Japanese are a menace to American women." Mobs attacked Chinese, Japanese, East Indian, and Korean farm workers, Filipino immigrants, and drove them out of the communities in which they worked. Asian immigrants, including my grandparents, could not become naturalized citizens. The landmark case of Ozawa versus United States held that the Naturalization Act permitted naturalization only for white persons. And after 1870, Black persons and Asians were neither Black nor white. Ozawa, of course, had lived in the country for 20 years, during which time he had graduated. He had attended the University of California, raised his children speaking English at home. In United States versus Thin, the court similarly held that a Hindu from India could not be a naturalized citizen, explaining that whatever an ethnologist might say, a person from India is not white. And said that it's a matter of familiar observation and knowledge that the physical group characterization of Hindus rendered them readily distinguishable from the various groups of people commonly recognized as white. So that race was not scientifically defined, it's about what someone looks like. As Paul mentioned, alien land laws existed, anti-miscegenation statutes existed. Many of these anti-miscegenation statutes based on the view that Asian Americans were unclean and diseased. Asian Americans went to segregated schools. In 1927, Gong Lum brought suit after his 9-year-old American-born daughter, Martha Lum, was denied entry to a white school in Mississippi, and the court affirmed her exclusion based on the line of cases approving separate but equal schools for Black. And so over and over and again, we see these racist laws based on views of Japanese Americans as foreign and dangerous. Again, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the government ordered the mass removal and incarceration of 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. 2/3, including my parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, were American citizens, all out of fear that they posed a threat of espionage and sabotage. In the infamous Korematsu versus United States case, the court upheld FDR's executive order and military orders that led to the mass incarceration, accepting the government's argument that Japanese Americans as a group posed a threat of espionage and sabotage. 40 years later, in the mid-1980s, Fred Korematsu and 2 other men, Gordon Hirabayashi and Min Yasui, successfully challenged their wartime convictions by filing petitions for writ of error quorum nobis on proof that the government, while it was arguing its cases before the Supreme Court, suppressed, altered, and destroyed evidence bearing on the issue of military necessity. So one thing I want to say is that in today's environment, it would be surprising to see the types of blatantly discriminatory laws that were prevalent in the past. Although there are certainly politicians and members of our media who propose them and advocate them from time to time. However, as lawyers, it's really critical that we remain particularly vigilant about facially neutral laws, ostensibly enacted for the public welfare or for the national defense that have been adopted for discriminatory reasons, are discriminatorily enforced, or that otherwise have a discriminatory impact. And we should be particularly vigilant about those laws in the context of an actual or perceived threat, when the country is apt to turn on vulnerable communities, and the courts have shown a reluctance to intercede. So Executive Order 9066 that FDR issued that kind of led to the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans did not name Japanese Americans on its face. On its face, the order authorized the Secretary of War to control the movement of civilians as might be necessary, militarily necessary. But everything around the order confirms that it was directed at Japanese Americans. The Supreme Court, in upholding those orders, said it had to defer to the government on issues of national security, and that its decision upholding those orders was not about Fred Korematsu's race. It was about national security. And we've seen and continue to see other, quote, facially neutral laws that threaten historically marginalized communities. During the AIDS crisis, for example, an article came out called Fred Korematsu and AIDS. It was a time when people were talking about quarantining people who were gay and living with AIDS. And the writer said that we have to be particularly careful when the government institutes policies in the name of health or security that could harm marginalized communities. In Trump versus Hawaii, despite evidence that the travel ban was based on anti-Muslim animus, the court said that its role was severely limited in reviewing an order that was neutral on its face. Justice Sotomayor, in dissent, of course, drew parallels between the so-called Muslim travel ban and the Korematsu case, saying that the parallels were replete when you label a group of people based on their faith or their appearance or their race as terrorists or as a threat to our country. The majority said that Korematsu had nothing to do with the case, and that the court was dealing with a facially neutral order that said nothing about Muslims without noting, and also said that this case is nothing like Korematsu, although failing to note that the order in Korematsu was also facially neutral. So I think the lesson from this is that when the issue is national security or public welfare, people will often say, this situation is different. This is nothing like Korematsu. This is nothing like the bad things we did before, without recognizing that the national security, the public safety rationale can be used to mask discriminatory actions against vulnerable communities. So in closing, lawyers have played key roles in this terrible history. Earl Warren called for the removal of Japanese Americans when he served as Attorney General of California, and of course later regretted his role and went on to a distinguished career as a champion for civil rights during his time on the Supreme Court. On the other hand, I think about the lawyers who fought those early discriminatory laws and lawyers now who work to challenge injustice, some of whom are on this panel with me, and I'm pleased to present with. As lawyers and private citizens, we can do so much to eradicate bias that exists in the law, but also to speak up against hate and aid in challenging practices that harm communities. And I'm really looking forward to a discussion with all of you about ways that we can partner together in that continuing struggle.
Thank you, Lori. Next, I think we'll go to John Yang, and John's going to talk about some of the legal and current issues arising in this anti-hate environment. Clearly, his organization is one of the groups that are leading us in this anti-hate organizing. So I'll hand it over to John.
Great, thanks, Paul, and I really appreciate this opportunity to present with all of my fellow colleagues here. And I think Lori set out the backdrop really well and some of the legal cases really well, and that's actually a very important through line to what we are dealing with today. And just to give you some statistics about what we are dealing with today, an organization called Stop AAPI Hate just recently issued its most recent report that shows over 6,600 incidents of hate against Asian Americans in the last 13 months. And these statistics we know are just the tip of the iceberg. When you do public opinion polls, surveys done by Ipsos, Pew, an organization called AAPI Data, those surveys are consistent in showing that about 30% of Asian Americans say they have been discriminated against in this past year, believing that COVID was one of the causes. So if you're talking about 30% of the Asian American population, a population of 23 million people, we're talking about potentially somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 million people being affected by this. Let's just relate to the history that Lori talked about. Well, it relates to history precisely because she talked about how national security and public welfare oftentimes drive bad results. And here we have a combination of both factors. First factor is public welfare. That's COVID-19. Look, because of COVID-19, everyone has fears, or legitimate fears, about health consequences caused by COVID-19. And when people have fears, unfortunately, they oftentimes look for something or someone to blame. And we had a circumstance in which the former president, among others, clearly cast the blame on the Asian American population by using terms such as China virus, Wuhan flu, other even worse terms than that, terms that we know had no medical benefit. We know were criticized by the CDC and the WHO, the World Health Organization, and clearly had a consequence on the population. So that conditioned people to think of Asian Americans as the enemy, as the other, as the perpetual foreigner, as Lori aptly described. So that certainly led to the hate that we're talking about today. But the other aspect that I think we need to be very, very clear and careful about is the fact that even after COVID-19, so to speak, recognizing that this is going to be with us for a while, but even aside from the health concerns, economic concerns of COVID-19, we do have real geopolitical tensions with the Chinese government. What they are doing with the Uyghur minority, the Muslim minority in Xinjiang, is deplorable, and we need to call them out. What they're doing in dismantling democracy in Hong Kong is also something that we as a government, we as a people, should be criticizing. But we need to be very, very careful as we are criticizing these government policies. We are not taking that to be an indictment of a society or a particular group of people. That is unfortunately precisely what happened in World War II with respect to the Japanese American, where you had this situation where so-called national security concerns, potential legitimate ones, that bled over into a backlash against the community. And so even as we get past COVID-19, that's something that I think we have to think about. Now, in terms of thinking about, well, what does this mean in terms of solutions? And since we have, this is part of the ABA, we have a group of lawyers, I expect that many of you have seen that Congress is looking at passing new hate crimes legislation. It's passed through the Senate right now, and it is before the House right now. So let me be clear about what that means and sort of how it falls into the context of everything that we're talking about. So this legislation does not create a new crime. It actually is more focused on data collection. And this we do think is important because, as I said, the data that we have, we know is woefully inadequate. The data that the FBI has, we know is woefully inadequate. And part of that is the level of resources given to collecting this data. So one of the things that the hate crimes bill does, there's two components to it. One that was sponsored by Senator Hirono, and another that was sponsored by Senator Blumenthal that have been combined. What this does is allow for the better reporting of data. Among other things, it allows the federal government to give sub-grants to state governments, local governments, to do better data collection and to so-called report it up. And I think there's definitely a role for lawyers to play in all of this is, all of you know, good data, good evidence produces better results. So for those of you that are involved in this system, it's making sure that it gets implemented correctly. It's making sure that we have an understanding, that we have reporting of this. But that's only part of the solution because frankly, legislation is not going to legislate away racism. And frankly, even just focusing on the criminal aspect of some of the incidents that we're seeing is just an inadequate response. I think this is where we as lawyers have even just more of a social aspect, if you will, to play. Now, oftentimes we are in situations where we could speak out, we could correct the history, correct the record, so to speak, about what is accurate and what is not. And that's a place that I think is exceptionally important at this time. The other place that I think is exceptionally important is to broaden this discussion. It's not just about attacks against the Asian American community. We've talked about the history behind that, but it's not lost on me that this is occurring against the backdrop of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Ahmaud Arbery, more recently of Daunte Wright. It does not get lost on me that it's against the backdrop of the insurrection at the Capitol, just a couple of miles from where I live. We have to think about this in broader terms about what it means for our democracy and an assault on our democracy. And one place here is, I would ask all of us, if we are to really seriously combat racism, what is our role in talking about voting rights? What is our role to ensuring that all of us are equal participants in this democracy? Because certainly when you're looking at some of the legislation that is being considered in state houses, state legislatures, that legislation clearly has a target against communities of color. And frankly, this should not be a political issue. For us as a democracy, we should want more people to vote. we should believe that if people are allowed to vote, then we compete in ideas. And certainly I'm not in a position to say that you absolutely have to vote this way. But we want to be in a position that then we debate our ideas and then we settle it at the ballot boxes. What is happening now, however, is that we are trying to minimize the presence of democracy. And that does clearly have an effect on who has a voice here in America. So although I recognize that this is a panel about Asian Americans and the law, there's a role here that law intersects with all of our communities of color, and in particular, Asian Americans. Here, Asian Americans voted at a rate that was 20% greater than we voted in the 2016 elections. And clearly, if you look at some of the trends in terms of where we voted, clearly we made a difference in states such as Georgia, states such as Wisconsin. And so we have to think about this in a broader term in terms of how we combat that racism. Let me stop here and certainly get back to all of you and talk about some of the other questions and really thinking about how we together can work together to show better solidarity.
Thank you, John. Next, we're going to go to Deepa. I think one of the things that we need to remember is more recent history and not just what's happened since the virus, but we have seen hate unleashed against groups based on something that's occurred outside the country or here, and we've been having to respond to that. So Deepa, can you help us?
I will try. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. Really great to be here with all of you. And Paul, anytime you make a request, I tend to say yes. So thank you for your leadership over all of these years for our communities. I'm going to actually try to share my screen and show a quick PowerPoint. So bear with me. If it doesn't work, I will move on from it. So can anyone tell me if you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, it is working. Great job. Yes, Deepa.
Excellent. Okay, great. Thanks. So I actually just wanted to really quickly just start with just my point of entry into this conversation. I'm a South Asian American immigrant, lawyer, and activist and writer. And much of my work has been in Asian American and South Asian communities. And I led an organization called SALT, South Asian Americans Leading Together, for a decade, which was really shaped by the 9/11 moment. So just wanted to say that. And this picture actually that you're seeing right now is a picture that was taken about 5 days after 9/11. When we gathered at the Japanese American Memorial in Washington, D.C., to actually send a message to say that we can't repeat what happened during World War II with the incarceration of Japanese Americans. It is a dated picture. Sadly, we have returned to that memorial many, many times over the last 20 years to send this same message. So I just wanted to kind of remind us of that. And the importance of Japanese American solidarity that we continue to see in these times. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened in the days and months right after 9/11, and then how that stretches into today. And then I'll close with some lessons learned that we might be able to take from it. Paul, let me know, or Ali, let me know if I'm going too long, and I will compress. So in the days and months after 9/11, we began to see sort of two dynamics emerge. And these dynamics really are at the intersection of Islamophobia, xenophobia, and racial anxiety in this country that was already percolating at the time. And the way that these dynamics ended up showing up were in terms of hate violence and state violence. When I talk about hate violence, I'm not only talking about murders and assaults, I'm also talking about a range of other ways in which people were discriminated against. So some of these, for example, included, and again, this is right after 9/11, this immediate sense of a narrative that emerged, right? That, South Asians and Muslims and Arabs lost our, quote, model minority status, if we ever had it, within hours after 9/11. And so another narrative and perception took hold out of the terrorist. And what we began to see were, in the hate violence category, obviously hate violence against our communities. Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh American, was shot and killed outside of his Chevron gas station on September 15th. That was just the first in a long array of, unfortunately, names that we remember and continue to hold of our community members who were killed because of hate violence after 9/11. But it went further than that too. We also began to see vandalism at our places of worship, where people felt like their safest spaces, mosques, temples, gurdwaras were no longer safe. We began to see bias incidences in the workplace that particularly affected Muslim and Sikh communities and Muslim women in particular. We also began to see sort of this, profiling on airlines and in airports, flying while brown, where people were either kicked off of planes or they were refused entry into the planes, or they were patted down, secondary screening that was not necessary. We also saw in the schools, in the education context, bullying of Sikh and Muslim children began to increase as well. So all of this was happening sort of right in the days and months after 9/11. But of course, as you know, it didn't end right in the days and months after 9/11. We have continued to see hate violence, employment discrimination, airline profiling, and vandalism over the last 20 years. So in addition to hate violence, we also began to see state violence, where we saw the United States government within hours of the 9/11 attacks decide to take measures to identify who had perpetrated these crimes, who was related to those attackers, and started to go into communities in Los Angeles, in Brooklyn, Queens, and really started to pick people up. So as you all know, what we saw was a conflation of national security policy and immigration policy that came together in the United States. And as we know now, the entire, the Department of Homeland Security emerged after 9/11, right? So what we know now as DHS is actually a post 9/11 creation. So what are the types of, state violence that our communities endured? Well, I mentioned the arbitrary detention and deportation of people. The Patriot Act, of course, which expanded the surveillance of our communities, but also surveillance generally, right? From libraries to our online searches and the like. We began to see a policy called NSEERS, or special registration, that was focused on targeting countries that were majority Muslim countries, and people who were 16 years and older and male had to report to immigration authorities and answer questions about where they prayed, when they traveled last. Many were actually detained and deported. And in addition, we started to see, in the years after 9/11, maybe even 10 years after 9/11, the growth of this local and national surveillance infrastructure. So for example, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation working with the JTTFs, which are Joint Terrorism Task Forces that were created all over the country to, again, surveil communities who are Arab, Muslim, and South Asian. And we began to see surveillance extend to mosques, to Muslim schools, to even Muslim students associations, right? Where the New York Police Department in particular was creating this sense of fear in New Yorkers who were trying to just pray, right? Praying while Muslim is not a crime, as this particular slide says. And this surveillance also extended to the Obama administration, where we started to see a program called Countering Violent Extremism, or CVE, which, while it talked about violent extremism, it was actually disproportionately targeting Muslim communities and mosques in particular cities around the country. So the national security state, the surveillance state, plus the hate violence in all of its forms has really created an environment for South Asian, Muslim, Arab, and Sikh communities where we have felt under attack, been under suspicion for the past 20 years. Sadly, it has not ended, right? And so you'll probably remember, and I'll just point out a few, there are so many, but a few of these moments that have happened just in the past 10 years or so. So you likely remember the 2012 attack at the Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, where a white supremacist barged into that place of worship and killed 6 people and wounded many, many others. But we also saw more recently in 2017, the murder of Srinivas Kuchibhotla, an Indian American engineer in Kansas, in the wake of the rhetoric by President Trump that, John talked about this earlier with respect to COVID, but this inflammatory rhetoric that targeted immigrants and refugees and Muslims, right, is something that had been present throughout that administration. In addition to those forms of hate violence that we've continued to see, we have obviously seen policies, again, the state violence, right? So we knew that we would see the Muslim ban, and it happened. That was, as folks know, probably the first executive order that was signed by the Trump administration. We knew that was coming, and it, as Lorraine said, was challenged in court many, many times in its various iterations. And so what can we learn, right? What can we learn from this? I mean, one of the things I think that I have learned is that history repeats itself if you aren't paying attention. And it did. It did again. The lead up to the election and the aftermath of the 2016 election felt like a second post 9/11 backlash to many of us. And it was. And it felt like we could not rest. So one of the things that I think we need to remember is that history will repeat itself, and we have to actually shore ourselves up and pay attention, right, to any of the clues that are coming up. The second thing I will say that we need to pay attention to, or a lesson that is important, is that the law is absolutely important, but movement and organizing and community-based organizations are just as important, if not more, to shore up what is happening in our communities, right? So what, in terms of the law itself, some of the, and those of us who are lawyers, some of the things I'll quickly mention is, even if you work in government, I was actually a civil rights lawyer at the Department of Justice when 9/11 happened. Even if you are in government, I think one of the things that, I've seen people do is to fashion initiatives that actually address backlash, that address hate, that reach out to communities that are marginalized. Make sure that, we are actually coding and receiving complaints of discrimination appropriately. The EEOC, for example, did this. They started to code complaints of employment discrimination by Muslim, Arabs, and Sikhs under a particular category so they could know what the patterns were. So I think that's something that as government lawyers, folks can do. In other examples, what we have seen people do is to actually organize to do things like get regulations off the books, and lawyers help with this, right? So prior to the administration, to Trump taking office, there was a push to get rid of the special registration policy that had still been in the Federal Register. And so this is a slide of a rally that many of us attended to try to get rid of the special registration policy. We did actually under the Obama administration. However, Trump did not need that because he could use the executive order. We also wanted, have seen, for example, beyond the legal side, again, tremendous organizing. The entire landscape of Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities looks so different than it did, on 9/11. And that is because our communities have organized, we have come together, we have taken to the streets, we have pushed back, we have advocated, and we have used a multiplicity of strategies in order to push back as much as we possibly can and to build. And other examples of how lawyers are doing their work is at the local level. So things like the Coalition for a Safe San Francisco, which actually led to San Francisco saying no to the Joint Terrorism Task Force over the past couple of years, is a real win. So if we can't get it federally, we go locally, right? And so this is another example of working with lawyers working with organizers to make a significant policy shift. And then lastly, solidarity. That is the last lesson that I will leave us with. Solidarity is a strategy that can push back against racism, right? And I saw this, and I've seen this time and again working in our communities. This is a picture of Holly Yasui, whose father was incarcerated, who brought one of the lawsuits that Lorraine mentioned. We were able to bring Holly to a rally that we organized after the Muslim ban, and the way in which she talked about the connections, right, was so strong, so powerful between the incarceration and what was happening with the Muslim ban. And that sort of solidarity you can see here, Muslim communities, Japanese American Citizens League, marching together. this is, I think, where we can see the possibilities for what can happen when we come together. We're also seeing that kind of solidarity when it comes to Black communities that John mentioned already, with South Asians and Asian Americans really understanding that Black liberation has to be part of our liberation strategy as well. So I think that I will end there. Well, I will end with Grace Lee Boggs, who always says things much better than any of us could, and appreciate the opportunity. Look forward to answering any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepa. It's clear that a lot of the discrimination and backlash has hit Asian American small businesses and certainly our restaurants. I think we've seen some of the really profound both damage and activism coming from people in small business, and particularly in restaurants. With that in mind, I'd like to hear from Tim Ma to talk about what he's done and what he's observed, both in this recent increase in hate, but also what he knows from his experience in history beyond that. Tim?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you everybody for having me. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an activist. Maybe I can be called a community organizer at times, but I'm mainly just a chef, and normally when I talk to this many lawyers, it's probably because I'm in big trouble or about to be in big trouble. So this is refreshing for me to actually be able to speak to a bunch of lawyers, not on that pretense. I guess a lot of my experiences, I guess it depends on how you look at it, but a second generation American immigrant. So I was born in Arkansas. And I say this because a lot of what we have done lately is a function of me born in Arkansas in the 70s. And even some of my restaurants are named after my experiences based on here. So as a child, you don't realize when things are happening to you or why. And so, and you don't have many memories, but my memories are based around a brick being thrown through my window. And mainly because when my parents were naturalized, they were actually put on the front page of the paper in the tiny Arkansas town that we were in. And with that brings a lot of good attention and some bad attention. And so mainly my experiences that I remember were based around the bad attention that you get, rocks being thrown at me as a child, not understanding why other than the way that we looked. And so subconsciously, my parents actually raised me and my sister to be very American. And that meaning, feeding us American food and not Chinese food, or speaking to us only in English rather than Chinese. And so over time, I think I got conditioned into becoming more American than being more Chinese. And to the point that I don't speak Chinese, I don't know much about Chinese food. And so even to the point that my parents would introduce me to other Chinese people as their American son, Timmy. I don't go by Timmy anymore. And so that's actually the restaurant that I have here in the Eaton is actually called American Son, based on the story of how I was conditioned over time, so that if I didn't have an accent or I didn't smell like soy sauce and garlic, then people would look past me looking differently. And so as a function of, I had a previous career as an engineer and following the model minority myth, or in the case to my parents, that was the American dream, like having their child be an engineer, lawyer, or doctor. And then I threw all that away to become a chef and a small business owner here in America, which is what I would consider my American dream. And so over time, I cooked. I trained in French cuisine, knew nothing about Chinese cuisine, and went through opening several restaurants that were of what I would call fusion type, where, I would take American cuisine or French cuisine and put the influences of what I grew up knowing. And so that led all the way to, well, let's take us all the way to 2020 and the pandemic. And I think the pandemic allowed a lot of people to slow down and start to realize what was important to them or what legacy they would leave. And so again, like a subconscious thing, and that like we started to, me and my co-founder here, we started to trend towards heading towards cooking food that was more close to our heart, though we didn't know much about it, that being Chinese food here in America. And so we ended up opening a Chinese takeout, what's more American than a Chinese takeout. And so that is, and this Chinese takeout was actually 5 blocks away from the Capitol. And so on the day of the insurrection, we actually had to completely shut down and get everybody out of the restaurant. So for fear that we were running a Chinese restaurant, we were, what was considered as Chinese people, the cause of the pandemic. And we knew that it wouldn't be safe for us. And so when that happened, and then we started to see all the anti-Asian incidents that were publicized, me and several Asian American chefs here in DC decided to use our platforms to do something about it. And, we're not activists or lawyers, and we don't know the mechanisms to affect change, much as everybody else on this panel does. But we knew that, we had a platform to speak on that a lot of people listen to, and we have the ability to raise a ton of money because, food is, a very good mechanism to raise money in these cases. And so what started as one dinner that we decided to do to raise money here in DC became overnight 9 dinners and 45 chefs here in DC. And from that, we knew that there was something to this. And so what we took these 9 dinners and we were like, well, let's just get bigger. We weren't exactly an organization at that point. We were just a bunch of chefs here in DC that were wanting to do something, right? We just didn't know what to do. So like, well, let's do what we know. Let's cook, and then take this money and donate it to organizations like Stop AAPI Hate. And so we started to reach out to other cities. And so from this one dinner, 4 weeks later turned into, I think it's over 200 dinners in San Francisco, New York City, Pittsburgh, and Detroit, and here in DC. And, we've, with the help of a firm named Morgan Lewis that I understand is pretty big. Again, we're just chefs. They have helped us to become an actual organization where we can hopefully raise money and use that money to donate to organizations that can affect change. And we hope that this will be an organization that will last in perpetuity past the month of May, though a lot of our work is currently happening as we speak. And so, I'm just happy to be able to learn. Like a lot of this is us learning as chefs and Asian Americans about how we can affect change and hopefully set an example of how, even though we're not in that field of activism, we can use our platforms to organize on the ground here and affect the communities that we're directly in.
Okay, thank you, Tim. We have started to get a number of questions. So the first question has a very specific framework, but I think I'd like people to think of it in a broader sense as well. The question was that, can you charge someone with a hate crime if they discriminate against somebody or attack somebody because of the assumption that that they're carrying large amounts of cash, or in addition, the question of whether the person is vulnerable because of them being Asian. Does that allow for someone to be charged with a hate crime? Now, that's a specific question, but the broader question raises the issue of intersectionality generally. Economic vulnerability or a resource assumption that's based on a racist stereotype in the first place. But we've also seen that hate crimes don't generally occur in specific categories. I remember when I was with JSL and pressing justice to look at hate crimes in different cases. So there were these other aspects that were not racial. So maybe this shouldn't be a hate crime. And I think I don't think anything occurs in a vacuum, and certainly we can think about the murders that occurred in Atlanta where many responded, "Oh, this is about the business the victims were in, or because they were women." But nevertheless, most of them were Korean American. So I'd like people to respond first to someone who can deal with the issue of what this an economic crime targeted racially could be a hate crime, and then secondly, what issues are raised by the intersectionality in terms of the hate violence and hate activity that's been occurring. Who wants to tackle that first?
Well, I can address the hate crime part, and then other people could talk about intersectionality, perhaps.
Okay.
I'm going to give a classic lawyer's answer, which is it depends. Why I say that is there are hate crimes in the books of all but 2 states in the United States. So there's state statutes. So first you have to look at what the state statute protects, right? I think the 2 states, if I remember right, are South Carolina and Wyoming. I'm not sure about Wyoming. I know South Carolina is one. So if you're a lawyer in one of those jurisdictions and you believe in hate crimes, then that is something that you could think about in terms of advocacy. But aside from that, so typically the hate crimes are statutes that are, number one, they're penalty enhancers. They don't create a separate act, if you will, that is criminalized. They typically sort of take an existing crime and adds a penalty if it was motivated because of a protected class. And when I say protected class, again, it depends on the state, but it typically would involve race, gender, sexual orientation, age in some places, disability in other places. So one of these protected classes. Now, the term I used was because of. And so then the question becomes, well, what does that mean, right? Does it have to be a substantial factor? Does it have to be a motivating factor? Or is there any sort of but-for causation? And then you have to look to the states. So it's interesting. In Georgia, same act, so to speak, 2 different jurisdictions. One jurisdiction is going to use Georgia's hate crime statute. The other is not. So this goes to sort of the discretion that is oftentimes involved, as all of you understand, when it comes to prosecutions, and then to the education that is necessary in thinking through the implications of these decisions that are made.
Does anyone else want to respond to the intersectionality aspect?
I'm not sure if I'm going to exactly respond to that, but I just wanted to add on to what John said, a couple of things. I mean, first, it's, I think, important to recognize that when we talk about protected classes, as John just said, there are multiple reasons, right, that people often are subjected to hate violence. So, for example, when we think about what happened in Atlanta with that particular mass violence, folks have argued that it is based on gender, it is gender identity, it is based on race, right? So that's where you see the intersectionality happening. When you think of some of the hate violence that I mentioned post 9/11, there is a race element, but there's also a faith element. And when those crimes happened after 9/11, please keep in mind that this was pre-Matthew Shepard Act, right? We did not actually have, there was a law on the books, but that law actually would only allow hate crimes prosecutions, or as John said, penalty enhancers, if you were engaged in a federally protected activity and endured an act of hate violence. It was extremely narrow. So none of those folks that I mentioned could actually avail themselves of hate crimes laws because they just didn't apply. The only other thing I'll quickly say is, hate crimes legislation is contested territory right now. As we think about the movement, right, around defunding the police and to actually limit the long arm of law enforcement in different communities, a lot of community-based organizations, a lot of organizers are talking about the importance of alternative solutions. What are those, right? So those could include, for example, making sure that victims assistance funds and compensation funds are funded fully. In many states, they are not. It could mean, for example, ways to prevent hate violence to happen in the first place. So what does it mean to actually bring communities together so that they are talking to each other and building bridges with each other? A third piece is systemic. The root of hate violence oftentimes is that people are not getting what they need, right, in their communities. So what does it mean to actually make sure that folks have access to basic benefits and services so that they're not scapegoating each other? So those are some ways in which folks are thinking about community alternatives to safety and dignity that go beyond hate crimes legislation. So I just wanted to add that into the mix as well.
Thank you. Anyone else on this one? One thing I would comment on is that the Atlanta killings really do raise a significant portion of hate against Asians is very gender specific. A lot of the stereotypes about Asians are Asian women. There's a sexuality and exoticism. Some of it on the more micro level, but some of it very, very ugly. I think that violence against women generally is a very significant issue and need in our society to address. So that crossover exists, and you should be able to pursue both aspects of a crime. And in terms of education, in terms of correcting the prejudices that people have. So that is an important thing. We have another question actually coming from a friend of mine in Sacramento, which has a very specific aspect, but I think there's a broader aspect that people may wish to comment on. And the question is, during the Jim Crow South days, there really weren't that many Asians in the Deep South. But in that era, there were clear legal limitations on the rights of African Americans generally. And the question was, did Asians in that period, were they white or were they colored? And under those laws. And I do know there weren't that many Asian Americans, but I know a number of Japanese Americans who were involved either with the camps in Arkansas or people who were in the 442nd in the bases in the South. They were kind of befuddled by that. Do we go to the back of the bus or can we sit anywhere we want? And at least one person told me, well, the bus driver told him he could sit wherever he wants because they're not black. But he went to sit in the back anyway because he was uncomfortable. But first, I mean, if anyone knows how that was, I know it's before your time, Tim, but you lived in the South. So if you have heard anything, I think anything that would help. But the other issue is, what are the regional ramifications, both of the current wave of anti-Asian hate and the laws and issues John was pointing out? The laws differ from state to state. We're more and more unified as a nation, but we see some of this hate occurring in the Midwest as much as the South. But I'd like to hear what people have to say about that. Anybody?
I'll take a crack. It's a really big question. I think that number one, so I don't think that, consistent with your story, I don't think that Asians were categorized as Black in the Jim Crow South. But it raises the question that I first raised at the beginning, which is, what is race? Race is not a scientific construct. It's not a biological construct. It's really, this country has categorized people racially, and sometimes in very bizarre, weird ways, right? That basically Asians are not white for the purposes of citizenship, but they are white for the purposes of Jim Crow South. And it's the whole ridiculousness of categorizing people. And it comes down to the way they look, and it comes down to history, and it comes down to culture, and it comes down to white and non-white, I think, in most situations. So one of the things I want to respond to there is that it's really important that I think people of color during this moment, and as Deepa discussed, people are coming together to understand the racial constructs in this country as something that we all share together, as opposed to something that divides us. Asian Americans on the surface have enjoyed the model minority myth, right, for many years. Asian Americans are successful, they're the model minority, in many ways held up to other minorities as kind of like, good compliant minorities who are studying hard and doing well. But actually, number one, the Asian, as was mentioned earlier, the Asian Pacific construct is really diverse. You can't, there is not one group. There's Japanese, Chinese, Pacific Islander, Korean. There's a very, very large South Asian, communities within that. We can't be lumped together. And secondly, I think it's been used as a wedge between minority communities in this country. And we can't allow that to happen, for Asian Americans to be allowed to be held up in a way to harm others. And we need to stand with other communities because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of what we have experienced derives from the same discriminatory roots that exist against other communities of color. And in addition, we Asian Americans owe a great debt to the Black community for having won many civil rights gains that we have enjoyed. And then lastly, I would say the model minority myth is only skin deep, right? That basically what we're seeing with present anti-Asian violence is that regardless of what people think about Asian Americans as a model minority, it really is only skin deep, that no matter what we've accomplished or what we've done, we will be seen as the virus walking down the street. And so I don't think we can be complacent about us being different or about how we can not stand together with other communities of color.
Okay. One of the questions that we received, several people have chimed in. What about the issue of hate crimes or anti-Asian violence committed by African Americans? One person was indicating that he observed that, at least from his view, he thought most of the crimes that he heard of involved African American assailants. I've also heard people saying that statistically that's not the case, but in any case, the issue of crimes and harassment and hate violence by African Americans becomes an issue, especially as we try to work together as a community with African Americans. So I'd like to hear if and one person made a point that one particular prosecutor said, well, we can't pursue this as a racial-based crime because it was an African American committed it. I don't think that's legally sustainable, frankly, but what do you all think about issues raised by the observation of the appearance of many of these crimes being committed by African Americans?
Yeah, this is John. Let me start on this, and let me be very clear. The statistics don't bear that out. Now, admittedly, there are not that many studies. There's a study that came out in January of this year that said that 76% of the people committing attacks on Asian Americans are white. And there's a study that I understand is coming out next week from a professor from Michigan that says that I think somewhere in the neighborhood of only 5% of the attacks on Asian Americans are from the African American community. So the objective studies that are out there dispel that myth. Now, yes, we will be real that there are these viral videos that go around every now and then that show African Americans attacking Asian Americans. But I emphasize viral because we need to understand who is propagating these videos. Because I have a theory that there are people that are trying to divide our communities by using these videos. And let's be real about this. It's like which videos get reported on? And when videos are taken and reports happen, there's a skewing, right, to try to find places to pit communities against each other. Frankly, this is where the anti-Blackness in different segments of the community appear as well, is they tend to say, look, there's another case of an African-American committing wrong, right? So we need to be very sharp in calling this out. The last thing I would say is, even independent of these videos, think about the people that were killed in Atlanta. Think about the people that were killed in Indianapolis. Who was the attacker? A white male. That's what we should be thinking about.
I just wanted to add to this, if that's okay. Thank you so much, John, for laying that out. I guess I want to say a couple of things. One is, it's not surprising that people would focus on Black Asian violence because, that is really one of the tools of white supremacy, right? To pit each other apart, to drive a wedge. That's what the model minority myth is, right? It drives a wedge between Black and Asian communities. And so that is a continuing, trope and strategy that we see, and we have to really push against it. The other part that I have been learning so much from are the organizers in Oakland. I mean, Oakland, as you all know, right, is a Black community. It's also an Asian community. There's Chinatown in Oakland, right, where we have seen some of these incidences happen to Asian American elders. And what Oakland, Chinese organizers, Asian American organizers in Oakland, and Black organizers say in one voice is very similar, right? One, it is that, yes, communities do bear racist viewpoints against each other. Let's not, we know that, right? There is anti-Blackness in Asian communities. There is also anti-Asian bias in Black communities. I mean, this is not a surprise. That exists. But we also have to recognize, right, that the roots of hate violence oftentimes are because of white supremacy and because of capitalism, because of people not having access to basic human rights. Healthcare, jobs, education. And so then we are in this situation where people are fighting each other. Instead of the system, we fight each other, right? And so getting to the roots of why violence happens is a systemic issue. It is a policy issue. It is a legal issue. And so part of what Oakland organizers are stressing, right, is let us also turn our attention there. How can cities like Oakland actually make sure that Black and Asian communities are getting what they need so that they are not in the scarcity mentality, in this competitive mentality, so that we're not driving wedges against them. So I also really want to bring that up because I think that it's not just, just in the legal space, as John has said, that we can look at this, right? We have to kind of have a holistic viewpoint of what is actually happening in our communities as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question that someone has raised is part of the problem that we face in terms of people assuming that we're always foreign and that one group or another is to blame for something that results in hate activity. How do we get our educational system, particularly K through 12, where most of society goes through, to do more education about who we are and what our diversity is and what we've contributed to the society, which we see in the collegiate ethnic studies programs, but then the people who don't sign up for those courses is the case we really want to reach. So I know that there has been a bill passed in California for inclusion. And more recently, the new Asian caucus in the Illinois legislature passed a bill to include it in K through 12 specifically. So does anyone have any thoughts on that? How important is the education and how do we get it included?
I think the education is absolutely critical, and that lawyers, everybody in this audience, can do something about it. That is, write op-ed pieces, go to your school boards, letters to the editor, say that ethnic studies, although it's hard for me to think about it in terms of ethnic studies, it's really like an inclusive American studies, right, needs to be taught in our schools, and that will go to some of what Deepa and John were saying earlier about a non-legal response is to educate our children. So much of what we're talking about is really changing the culture, right? And so not think about it as ethnic studies, but really think about it as America. And so I think if we can talk to our children about another view of America, that will start them early on understanding that we are Americans, that race is just a social construct, that there have been Asian American, that what's happened in our history and what we need to not do over and over again, which is like, don't repeat this history, is critical. I think ethnic studies and classes about racial minorities are under attack. I think there are people out there who want to get rid of it. We were involved in a lawsuit in Arizona that sought to get rid of a really successful Mexican American studies program. So you hear these efforts coming out saying, well, this is teaching these stories about teaching Mexican American literature or Japanese American history are divisive. They're un-American. They teach students to hate people, but they're actually really teaching students that this is what America looks like, that it's a way to work together towards a better future. And so this is something I think needs to come from the grassroots up, which is basically each of us taking responsibility to say that this is an important priority for our schools. The second thing I'll say is there's lots of resources out there. There are lots of resources. There are people willing to speak. There are curriculum guides out there about these histories. And it's really just a matter of looking for them. If people want to write to me, I'm really glad to make some connections. And I'm sure everyone on this panel can do that. But I constantly hear from teachers saying, we want to teach it, but where do we find the materials? They're out there, but I really think that it's up to each of us to advocate for it, because it's not going to happen on its own.
I would add one challenge for the people that's watching this right now, which is it's Asian Pacific Heritage Month. If you have kids in public, not even public school, K through 12, get your teacher or get your school, if you can, to have one day, maybe it's even 1 hour, depending on what your appetite as an advocate is, to teach Asian American history, right? Because if all of us, this is very doable. This is a very small piece that each of us can do, even independent. I agree with Lori that having legislation is important, having certain, but while we're doing that piece, let's do this little piece, if you will, and at least start that process. Because if each of us could put a brick onto that building will get built pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think it's important for each of us to consider how we can affect policy and these sorts of issues. I do know that going back to my own experience in the Midwest, that one of my teachers, when there was some like brief coverage in American history about the Japanese American internment, said, yeah, but these were only for people who were spies. I said, well, that's my family. And my dad was in the US Army. But so my parents went and talked to them, and that did result in some change. When I went to college at Northwestern in the Midwest, a private school, so there was no Asian American studies when I went through there. In fact, we really didn't have any Asian American groups at the very end of my time there. So later on, as an adult who's constantly being dinged by the university for contributions, and then when I got a presidential appointment, then they were really interested in me. I went and met with them and said, well, where's your Asian studies program? And although it was really the students who went on a hunger strike who really produced that program, and it's thriving now. So I think there are ways that each of us can affect policy. And just think about it. If there's something goes on in your kids' elementary or high school that you object to, most of us would take action because we very much care how our kids are affected. So, and to support African American history and Latinx history and gender studies as well, because there's just so much of the hate that every group gets is based on ignorance. And that's something that we can confront, and most easily at the earlier stage. If it's the later we get, the more set our prejudices are.
Let me also just mention, there's some really, really wonderful kids' books out there about Asian Americans. And so I just, again, I don't know about plugging certain ones. I can say I know about a book written by Stan Yogi about Fred Korematsu. There's graphic novels. So buy a book for your kid, buy a book, donate it to the local school library. The next law day, the next Constitution Day, go out to your school and tell students about this history that's out there. For your bar associations, for your civic organizations, invite people like the people on this panel to come and speak. I'm with a group of people that's talking to bar associations and civic organizations all over the country about the present day relevance of this history. And so there are resources out there, and you are an agent. All of you in this audience are an agent for making those connections. And I would say particularly in the Midwest and the South, this is where we really need to have these conversations because there's less of an Asian Pacific American presence in those areas.
Yeah, I think that's very true. One of the things that happened is that I had looked at George Takei's graphic novel about his time in internment, and I got together with some of my friends, Caucasian friends, who were, one of them raised that, gosh, my kids got almost nothing about this. How can I fill them in? So I immediately ordered that book for them, and she said they loved the book, and actually started telling their friends about the internment, and that Sulu was involved.
Yes.
So there are a lot of things, and books for adults. I know Deepa's written a book that's very powerful about diversity, and I think that we're all still capable of being educated. So, and that ties to all the prejudice and all the legal stuff that we're pursuing as well. We did get another comment. Someone raised, what about the issue of crimes or harassment that occurs from people who claim mental illness as an excuse, that was used as a bar to significant prosecution to a case in San Francisco? It's both a question of hate crimes, but just any kind of crime. There is a lot of mental illness issues that get raised, but how do we protect the community when it's often seen as a reason why not to pursue? Thoughts? I know one thing in the police violence discussions, people have raised that in law enforcement generally, the one thing that isn't looked at is the resources that public safety doesn't bring to the table are the resources to use mental illness training and counseling to de-escalate situations. Maybe more people with mental health backgrounds can help somewhat. But I think the specific question here was when mental health is used as an excuse. It doesn't mean someone can't be directed towards some kind of treatment. But anyone have any thoughts on that? No. Okay. Well, I do think it does come up, and the whole issue of protecting the community. On the one hand, I don't think the police are always the answer. So I mean, that's one of the answers to dealing with situations. But certainly, if mental illness results in a crime, some kind of solution should be sought. And it may not be prosecution; it may be treatment, it may be education. But whatever is involved, I think it does raise issues of because one avenue of resolution isn't available or isn't pursued doesn't mean there shouldn't be others. Particularly when violence or a threat to life is involved.
Following up on that, I absolutely agree with you that that in seeking justice for our community, we have to consider the big picture and acting in coalition with others, as we've said over and over again. And part of that is basically not increasing the carceral state, right? And not being agents and saying that we need to increase imprisonment, increase penalty. We need to find ways to de-escalate, to eradicate the violence that takes into account the type of humanity and community-based solutions that we seek for ourselves. So I think that that's really important.
One thing that one questioner has raised, and I think this could go to any panel involving Asian Americans or Pacific Islanders, we all deal with, and that we can probably count dozens, maybe even hundreds in my lifetime, people have raised this for me. Even when I was in Japan, people raised this issue. We get asked, where are you from? And we all have tried multiple answers to this, but it raises questions. Is this something, should we be angry? Do we avoid it? Do we educate? I'd like to hear what people have to say. This is specifically not a legal question. And I bet that Tim, having lived in the South and in other regions as well, might have some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I definitely think I tailored the question to the person that was asking. And for sure, we still do that to this day when people are talking about Lucky Danger, the Chinese takeout, they're like, where are you from? It's like, we understand that question is more about where our family is from. But I think we also used answers to kind of avoid any kind of confrontation. Whereas I think now we're more proud to speak about the Chinese part of us rather than the American part of us. But yeah, I think that question never really like angered me or upset me, as more so, use it as a step to like mend the bridge or to educate, to make sure that people understood that that can be seen as an offensive question.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, so I was born in India and lived there until I was 12 and moved to Kentucky at the time in the mid 1980s. So you can imagine what that was like. So kind of similar, perhaps, Tim, to your experiences. I think that for me, that question always was, I received it as a marker of my difference and my exclusion because, when I moved here, I had an accent. I was clearly sort of different, when I opened my mouth. And so I used to perceive it like that. But over the years, as you grow into your own identity and you get comfortable with who you are, I think it's not surprising that many of us are very clear about, what our heritage and what our background is. And so I do now say where I am from, but also try to make it clear that that question is one that is offensive and one that can be insulting, right? To make those kinds of assumptions. So to ask the questioner, like, what led you to ask that question? So it can be an opportunity to have a conversation with people. It can be an opportunity to actually talk about stereotypes and misperceptions that Asian Americans continually have to deal with. So I think it's an opener. And sometimes when we can have these brave conversations, I think we can shift each other's understandings, which is so important as we are in a multiracial country right now.
Okay. One question that was raised is the questioner was observing that white supremacists are reaching out to Asians to join their hate, even though some of it's directed towards us. And that what they were wondering is how can ethnic media play a role in dealing with the anti-Asian hate that's being put out there and to some degree picked up by some Asian Americans. Anybody? I have seen an article that said there's a growing number, although still I think relatively small group of Asian Americans who have linked up with kind of the Trump unleashed white supremacy that targets African Americans and immigrants generally, regardless of the fact that it comes back and hits us. I think it is true that ethnic media can play a role. The difficulty is ethnic media usually doesn't have the resources to go in depth and reach out to everybody in that way. But I do think that organizations that care about this can use ethnic media because they will respond to groups from the community. And I found if I want to send the message, particularly to the communities that are large enough to have ethnic newspapers, ethnic stations, that you can send messages about why this kind of hate is very damaging to us, and that when we throw rocks in that direction, we should consider who's going to absorb the damage from that. But I know none of our communities are monolithic, but I do know that there is a concern that we have an accurate understanding in our own communities.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I mean, I would just add that, I mean, yes, I think that there are segments within our community that are extremely conservative when it comes to policies around immigration and around education. And, you know, I don't know about the white supremacist piece. I haven't actually read anything on that, but there are segments, you know, particularly within the Indian and Chinese communities where you have seen folks organize actually less on ethnic media, but more on like WeChat and WhatsApp to really hold very problematic viewpoints, particularly that we've seen, I think, around affirmative action policies in different, you know, school systems, right, higher education to even elementary schools, as well as sanctuary policies that allow undocumented immigrants the opportunity to take sanctuary. So that's where some of that pushback has come. And I think that it is actually, to your point, Paul, it's really important for us to not discard members of our communities who might be sort of going down that path, right? It's actually important for us to figure out, how do we organize better? How do we actually utilize, you know, WeChat, WhatsApp, and ethnic media to reach our communities with these messages, because we can't ignore that they exist. So that is another kind of, I think, call to action that a lot of Asian American organizations are taking up, and trying to really figure out how to do that sort of base building and organizing at the grassroots level, particularly with new immigrants from Asia that are coming into our country, so that we have this like understanding, right, that we're part of civil rights struggles, that we have a history here that stretches well before 1965, and that we are actually, our fates are tied. Our fates and our futures are tied with other communities of color. So I think those sorts of messages and narratives and examples are really what we need to lift up when we're talking about organizing with different folks from, you know, different viewpoints.
Okay. I'm going to try to do this question. I'm trying to read it because I'm not sure I understand precisely what they're trying to do. Maybe people can understand it a little better than I. So the question is, can panelists comment on the significance of this moment for immigrant communities of different nationalities, quote, awakening, unquote, to the stark collective racialization of persons of Asian descent in US history and the present?
I mean, if I understand the question correctly, it's just, we are in a once in a generation moment with respect to Asian American activism and the understanding of Asian Americans and how we fit into the racism narrative. I think that's absolutely true. Then the question becomes for all of us is, what does that mean? What do we do with it, right? And I think Deepa, Lori, and Tim, all of you have spoken very well about how we have to use this moment to show solidarity, to come together, because it is fraught. There are those that are going to try to use this moment to divide us and use things such as education, other places where we've seen to become wedge issues. So there's an opportunity here, but we have to really use it wisely. The last thing I would just briefly mention with respect to ethnic media would be, I think here, for especially lawyers that work with ethnic media, whether as clients or the like, one of the places I think that they need help is also getting training about sorting through facts. And this sounds awful in some ways, but they don't have the resources like that large medias do. Frankly, large media don't always do this well either, is they will publish that is less than true. Going back to the other question about why African Americans are predominantly attacking Asian Americans, that's not true, but we see that in the narrative. We see that actually in ethnic media as well. So how do we make sure that the proper stories are getting told?
Yeah. Let me, I'm trying to get the most recent questions here. We need an national. Well, one person was asking and following up on John talking about the hate crimes legislation. What are the changes that have occurred in terms of hate crimes data collection? Are we going to be able to get more detail about each crime and the trends that are occurring under these new laws?
We will get details with respect to what protected class is being was the victim, but we won't have further details. If the question is, will we have an understanding of was the motivator white supremacy or was the motivator evangelical Christianity? I'm not sure the difference there, but that's a different discussion. That won't be part of the data.
I see. Okay, well, we're still getting questions, but I think we're about out of time. Can I ask ABA staff, where do we stand on time?
We are at time.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody. Sorry if we haven't gotten to you all. We'll try to respond to some of the questions that came in print. But I want to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar, which has been very informative. And although I respect all of your work, even more so after this panel. So thank you very much to the panelists and to all the people who joined us, and to the American Bar Association to do a quick commercial for the people who are lawyers out there. I know many don't join the ABA. Please do so. You can help move our profession in the right direction. We still have a ways to go even within the ABA, so consider contacting ambar.org/CRSJ to join, and then join the civil rights section. With that, I want to especially thank all of the panelists. It's good to see y'all. I haven't been out of my home much over the last year, so it's good to see people are keeping busy and doing the right thing. Thank you all for participating, and thanks to ABA.